We do like to start with taking a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, recognizing that WMU is located on lands historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Today, we're excited to be joined by Dr. Tatiana Bustos, a researcher and facilitator in the Transformative Research Unit for Equity at RTI International. She has a PhD in community psychology with certification in results-based accountability and as an implementation support specialist. She has more than 10 years of experience in the community-engaged research and evaluation field. She has collaborated with nonprofit foundations, universities, and executive leadership teams in state and local public health departments, and was awarded the Next Generation Rising Leader Award from the National Network of Public Health Institutes for her work in advancing equity in public health government. We do have a good-sized audience joining us today, so sometimes what will work best in this case is if you have a question, please go ahead and use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand. You can also enter questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that. And we also have some in-person here from the Evaluation Center here at Western, so we'll make sure we give some opportunities to in-person as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tatiana.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Let me just share my screen for just a moment. But thank you, everyone, for having me, for the invite. I'm really excited to see some names in the room, and now I'm nervous. But thank you for joining. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. So I'll be discussing CBPR principles and evaluation engagement, and I'll share a little bit more about my thinking around what I mean when I say evaluation engagement, and we'll get into some discussion about challenges. So I do have an interactive activity coming and some opportunities for alignment between the two. I know Samantha gave a really brief introduction, but just thought that it would be helpful to share my lens, so how I'm positioning this work. So I do want to emphasize that I have multiple identities, and I'm not going to belabor them, but I'm a community psychologist by training, but I do identify as an interdisciplinary scholar. So I have that PhD, but I also received formalized training in program evaluation and in implementation science. And so a lot of my lens in these discussions is how can I merge different concepts, methodologies from community psychology, program evaluation, implementation science to understand the practice-based components of doing certain types of work, both research and evaluation. I'm absolutely fascinated by the practice components of this work. And so that's what I'm really getting into the details about. And so what you'll be hearing today really starts from that positioning of these different types of exposures to disciplines, methodologies, into informing how we can engage more responsibly, but also in a way that emphasizes relationship building. That's what I want to mention. Okay, and some terms that I want to clarify that I'll be using throughout today. So I'll be using a couple of terms that may not be familiar to some of you, most of you, or some of you may know this. But in action research, some of you may know this, but we have terms like a critical friend. And what that means is a trusted person who's typically invited to join a project and provide that critical thinking. It's usually a community partner who's involved or has lived experiences. And what they do is provide an expansive understanding of the systems and call out certain dominant frames of the research that the researcher or evaluator typically has. And so I've adapted this term to think about community members as critical learning partners. And again, I'm referring to community members from marginalized backgrounds who are most often directly impacted by the work that we're trying to develop. And so just to give some context on if I mentioned that throughout the presentation. And what they do is really promote our learning, both the evaluator and the evaluation in different ways. I'm also referring to the term evaluation engagement rather than, some of you may know this as stakeholder involvement or stakeholder engagement. The stakeholder does have a violent and harmful connotation to it for certain groups. And so I've refrained from using that term unless I'm referring to an article title or framework. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today, and this is the last thing I'll mention before we get into it, but is that a lot of what I'm sharing is included in a book chapter that was submitted through Western Michigan University's Evaluation Center on core concepts in evaluation. And so I wanted to make sure that I reference, I'm only giving like a tidbit of what we talked about in that book chapter, and I have expanded some of my thinking around this, but just to make sure that that's referenced today. It's going to be released in May if you want to check it out. Lots of great authors in there. Okay, so our agenda. So we're going to begin with what is evaluation based on the research on evaluation literature. This is something that I'm diving deeply into, and I would love to hear some thoughts on, thinking about evaluation engagement as part of research and trying to understand the practice component. With this, we're going to think about some of the challenges in evaluation practice related to evaluation engagement. And so I'm going to have a group activity, chatterfall, whatever's easiest for folks to share some of the challenges that they've experienced and or whether some of the challenges I share resonate. Then I'll move into what are CBPR principles, give you an overview on how they directly relate to the challenges, at least based on my experience, and leave you again with some food for thought on opportunities and alignment. So I'm hoping this is more of a opening the door for discussion about how we really think about engagement in the practice component piece. And I have the last 10 minutes, around 10 minutes or less for questions. Okay. So what is evaluation engagement? And this is an interesting concept that I've been thinking about more recently and in other ways in community psychology. But when we all say generally evaluation engagement, we in this room may be thinking of different things as part of its practice components. So a lot of us may think of people first, that's definitely what we're thinking about when we say evaluation engagement. So but who that person is can vary, whether it's the program community member that's directly impacted by the work, the implementer of the program, so the team, the staffing, the funder, or someone else who might be part of that system, who plays a key role in the thing that you're examining as part of your evaluation project. We may think of different approaches, so the ways or the activities that we're involving people in our work. So each of us may be creating these different activities for engagement. There's also different points in time when we engage in terms of the phases of the evaluation. We may or may not also think about shared power, and influence. So the extent to which when we're involving people, it's actually meaningful in decision-making throughout the evaluation process and not just at certain points when it's convenient or feasible, just the fact that there are variations. And so what I've been finding, and so I've been deeply exploring this and just wanted to provide a really broad understanding and definition based on some literature, but evaluation engagement, and again, this is how I'm phrasing this, is defined as the participation or refers to the participation of different program community members, again, across variation of audiences who are involved in the project in any phase of the evaluation. So that's really a good definition to ground ourselves in the room, to think about where there needs to be more specificity in order for us to get to that place where we're implementing meaningful forms of engagement and perhaps even considering a more structured approach to the process itself in practice. So evaluation engagement is not new. I'm not in any way proposing that this is a new concept. We talk about this, its history. It's one of the core concepts in program evaluation in that book chapter that I mentioned earlier. It started with some of the first formal modern program evaluations, and there are several approaches that have formalized engagement as part of their approach, including these that you see listed here: culturally responsive evaluation, participatory evaluation, and there's more that extend beyond what you see on the slide here. But what I want to mention is that I'm by no means suggesting that we should do away with any of these, but what I write about in that book chapter is really that we have these approaches, but we don't often excel every time we apply this in practice. We often face these really unique challenges to the engagement process itself. And often that's because of several reasons that are within and beyond our control. So I acknowledge that there are things that are completely out of our control that really dictate how the extent of engagement in our work. But my thinking around this is always about what are the opportunities to enhance those engagement practices in a way that can guide us toward components that we know make partnerships successful. And so that's what connects my thinking to the process of community psychology and community-based participatory research. So that's some grounding around how I'm thinking about this, and that moves us into some of the challenges. So going back to the literature, and again, I've been diving into this, and I'm about to dive even deeper with a review, and hopefully that gets accepted. But so one of the most recent reviews on evaluation engagement connected to program evaluation in particular was in a systematic review conducted in 2014. And what the available information that they had based on this research was that these studies, the extensive review that they found, often discussed aspects of evaluation engagement in the study. There was a general description. But so we know that this is a common practice. People recognize its value. We understand that it has relevance. It can be useful for improving our evaluation results. And so that's not the issue that we're often facing. But they did find that many studies don't use a consistent criteria for meaningful engagement. And so in fact, a lot of the studies that were collected in that review tended to underreport key elements that could inform quality forms of doing engagement in practice. And so just building out from that and some of the other literature on community-based studies and how we engage in community and involving people in our work, both in research and evaluation, there's a general lack of involvement from people who are most directly impacted. And that's for several reasons, but the ones that are furthest from decision-making power don't tend to be the ones that we often select into that engagement project. There is little information on the extent of involvement that's been integrated into evaluation based on some of the studies and what level of decision-making. So we don't know. So we all in this room may be doing engagement in different ways, but it may be the same, it may be more, less. We don't have a consistent level of decision-making. There's no standard. There tends to be limited reporting on the expectations and learning of those who were engaging, and there's hardly any empirical data that is available to inform which engagement approach is better than another or for which specific populations. This is a broader issue that extends beyond program evaluation, but this is the reality of the challenges that we're understanding about engagement as a practice in research and evaluation. And so I'm going to get back to these challenges shortly and just share about how the CBPR principles help us shift our focus in being more intentional about the input that we're collecting, the learnings that we're gathering in our engagement with our work, and some guidance on the relationship building aspect. Part of the book chapter builds on the challenges to evaluation that myself and two other authors experience, and what we see and what we comment on is on the challenges that are more broadly experienced in program evaluation. It positions itself in connection to Weiss's rationale for the stakeholder engagement approach. And what that paper talks about, if you haven't seen it, is that stakeholder approach or stakeholder engagement is what it's termed in the book chapter. It can address several of the issues that we face in program evaluation, with it being narrow, having unrealistic outcomes, unused results, being unfair by design. I'm just kind of listing them out. But as I mentioned earlier, we still face the very same challenges when we involve people, and we start to be presented with these new challenges that are even more complicated. And so this includes navigating conflicts in an established structure that's already set for decision making. So for instance, a grant mechanism or a university-based setting. And so it can be difficult to manage a collaborative decision-making process, but that's common, right? That's often found across other collaborative evaluations according to Shua. But when we start to engage critical learning partners, I'm often faced with the issue of trying to understand the balance between, how can I align contradicting objectives of the evaluation, my organizational setting and position, and the community needs. And so I start to think about where can I make the changes? And I've been thinking about this as well, about one of the ways that we can find that balance and alignment is in early negotiations, done in collaborations with the partners that we're trying to engage in our work. But that itself requires relationships being established and having these strong foundations. And so this ties into the issue of when to engage. So we know, well, I know, based on my experience, that it's more meaningful to engage people earlier on in the evaluation, but the feasibility of that is often not available to us. And so I've had several projects where we're proposing an engagement component, we're all about it, but we need to write the grant in time. And so that starts to limit the time that would create that space for a co-creating process with communities, like an authentic co-creating process with communities. And that's the unfortunate reality. It's slowly changing, with some grants calling for an explicit community partner component, but even then their timelines and structures are the same. And so that's even more challenging to navigate the structures that don't, the systemic structures that don't change, even though we have other changes happening elsewhere. When we engage too late in the process, we don't often set up our partnership for success, and we don't set up our communities for success. And so that's something that we also talk about in connection to evaluation engagement. There's the issue of fairness and participation. So in terms of who gets selected, why, the representation piece, as I'm sure some of you may be familiar with, and how the types of decisions that you yourself are making can be influencing and biasing the process in the first place. And so what we share is that even with the most participatory process, you can overlook certain aspects that lead to those unfair decisions in program evaluations. And so as an example, I had shared an experience about a community advisory group that we were creating, and we had started to have conversations with our members, and we found that the broader organization that I was part of was constantly asking the same key players to participate in any initiative that they had created. It wasn't the first advisory group, but the same key players tended to be asked. And so it's really important, and one of the things I'll mention later is that it's really important that we start from a place of learning about the history and context of the communities or the people that we're trying to engage in our work. So as we engage these critical learning partners in the evaluation, we also have to navigate these other challenges that tie explicitly to equity, related to historical and current mistrust, balancing our work with language justice, and generally we continue to face the same challenges and more. And so that's kind of the message that I'm trying to portray here, and that requires us to refer back to not just these evaluation approaches, but look elsewhere into other interdisciplinary approaches that could offer a framing for relationship building, to navigate those collaborative decision-making challenges, to think about power dynamics more explicitly, and maybe even ideas to center practices that engage the evaluator in building their trustworthiness. And so what I'm suggesting is that we need more tools to guide our engagement process. And one of those that I wanted to share is really the CBPR principles into practice. So I do have an activity here, so I'd like to pause here and have us all think about some of the challenges that we may have experienced when we engage with different people in our work, in our evaluation process. You are welcome to, I think we have share in the chat. I was hoping to do a chatterful, so maybe you can write down whether this resonates, or a couple of challenges that you yourself have experienced in doing engagement. And I'll count down. I'll give you a minute to write that, and then I'll count down 1, 2, 3, and then you'll press enter. So write it down, but don't press enter just yet. I'll just do a minute. Oh, the question is, what challenges have you yourself experienced when you're applying engagement in evaluation, when you're doing evaluation engagement? Or did any of these resonate with you? Okay, folks can press enter. 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. Or 1, 2, 3. So I see folks sharing about virtually difficult to get people to share ideas and engage, the time needed for relationship building and building trust, avoiding tokenism, involving those with lived experiences, yes, the ones directly impacted and furthest from decision-making power, definitely. Oh, I love this one about, hi, Miles, a community gatekeeper who limits access to community members in ways that exclude those with different points of view. Yes, that's something that I have seen in government spaces where we're thinking, we have to serve all people, and how do we move towards just social justice and position different types of people who may have different views on what equity should look like in the advisory group. So that's something that's definitely a major challenge. So I see that there's a lot of challenges that people are experiencing related to relationship building. So that's a whole other, yes. The engagement piece, like what is it that people need to stay motivated and involved? And that ties into like making it meaningful. So that's something that I'll get into in just a moment. I don't have a solution for the community gatekeeper, but that gives me a lot of food for that. Having that representation piece. Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing. So I invite you to look in the chat and just reflect on all these challenges. We're trying to do this quality work of engaging. There are different types of challenges that are related to the structures. There's related to what we end up with, like how do we maintain representation and equity-centered decisions in what we've selected for the engagement process. And I'm not going to give you all of those answers, but I'm going to give you some forms of way of thinking about how to approach this in the next effort that you might have. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Thank you very much. You're welcome to keep sharing in the chat. Or I guess if anyone wants to share off mic, I have time for one person to share. There's a brave soul. All right, this is the piece I'm fascinated by, so that's why I'm really interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, so navigating these challenges of doing this quality work, meaningful evaluation engagement, really requires some strategies that are explicit about relationship building and collaborative decision making, while also attending to power dynamics. And so what I'm suggesting, both in my book chapter and in some other thinking that I have coming out, is that we can start to embed, and this is again not new, I'm just being more like I'm advancing it. I think it's a great idea. We can embed these elements of community-based participatory research principles into our practice, because it starts to prioritize that lens throughout the work in a way that I've shared with my experiences. And it can also be helpful in accessing, thinking about transdisciplinary work, these evidence-based resources that can provide guidance on how we might approach partnership engagement more systematically, or with reflective tools or other types of concepts. Like, so the call is for looking across disciplines and merging and shifting our lens towards that relationship building piece. And so this principles, if some of you are familiar, it's grounded in social equity, it's rooted in community psychology, and what it calls for is engaging community partners, critical learning partners, whatever you may refer to as partners, throughout an evaluation with promising practices that emphasize, again, these pieces of equitable power sharing, looking at the quality of relationships. And so I'm going to just quickly go through each of the principles and point out some of the alignment and opportunities. And I encourage you to think about, well, how can I apply this in my work? Or maybe you already are, and you didn't necessarily make that connection to these principles. So first, there's the opportunity or the priority in viewing communities as units of identity. So both in the sense of measurement. So there's a lot of work that's being done right now on building out the measurement of including community method in the methods itself, but as well as in the reflective piece, so how the evaluator or researcher is designing the work. There's some work being done on how to include different aspects of communities into the work. So yeah, I'll just say into the work. The other piece I want to mention about communities as identities is that, what's the other piece I want to mention? Oh, it's also informing how we perceive communities in the work. And I'm not sure I've seen that in like a certain prescriptive way of how we're seeing communities as these critical friends, these critical learning partners that really are necessary to, enhance objectivity. I know there's some work related to strong objectivity, for example, and in I think it's ethnography. But just building out that idea further in terms of, how we as researchers and evaluators perceive community. There's the principle that focuses on community assets and resources. So again, this is specific to community resources, the strengths that they may have, the capabilities that can be further leveraged to improve generally the quality of life, the quality of community life. And so the emphasis here is on an asset-based perspective to evaluation engagement. And there's an appreciative inquiry really aligns well with this type of thinking. So how can we focus on the strengths that may already be in place to enact or sustain participation in a meaningful way? So making that explicit connection to engagement, the practice components of engagement. And so an example of this may be, when you're planning your engagement, someone mentioned virtual meetings. When you're planning your engagement activities, are you taking a step back to think about whether that space is something that people have connections to? Is it a strength of the communities that you're trying to reach? Are they already comfortable with that space, or does it make access more difficult? And so it's informing the practice piece before you're actually doing the activity itself. Could be the same with the type of recruitment that you may be doing of certain people. So are you recruiting in a way that really leverages their existing community resources? I know that the gatekeeper is a different issue, but are you going to these faith-based organizations to try to identify key persons to involve in your work? So it's really forcing our lens to think about, like, what are the ways that we can leverage community knowledge and expertise into the practice components of engagement. Then there's pursuing mutual benefits. So in a lot of evaluation engagement approaches, like mutual understanding of the evaluation purpose and the expectations around engagement are made difficult. There's a citation that says that they are made difficult. Not difficult, made explicit and transparent. That's your first kickoff meeting. That's exactly what you're talking about. And so it's a check mark, right? We've done it. Expectations are clear and transparent. But we don't really know that for certain. Some of us may not know that for certain. We're not hearing that from people directly. So this principle moves engagement into social action by prioritizing community-centered benefits and gains. So, which is in line with some of the calls made with culturally responsive evaluation, participatory evaluation. But the advantage here is the connection to really thinking about collecting that feedback so that we're fostering a co-learning to really to push towards continuous improvement. Are the benefits in line? The benefits in line with the partner's expectations? Are we thinking about the extent, are we explicitly making that space to offer benefits that are actually mutual? And how are we making sure that we're meeting that successful benchmark throughout the evaluation? And so that's what I'm kind of thinking about, that connection here. Then there's foster co-learning and capacity building. So this extends partner engagement beyond routine activities. At least that's my thinking around it. So it's emphasizing that we're active we're active in co-learners, and we're constantly ensuring that there's capacity building among the evaluation team, and as well as the people that we're engaging throughout the process. And this requires evaluators to develop those relationships to be able to call out, this is not working, this needs to be better. And also allowing the space for the people that you're engaging to actually assess you in terms, or me, I'll just say me, in terms of my own practice and how I'm engaging in the work. And so this principle can be helpful in trying to have evaluators think about in ways that they can actually strengthen their capacities to participate in the evaluation itself. So are there onboarding materials available to them? Are there other ways that we can strengthen learnings and understanding of the project or of other issues that can make their engagement more meaningful? Then there's centering in ongoing feedback that's cyclical, iterative, and this is central to the engagement process overall. And again, this is in line with a lot of other evaluation approaches. But what this ties into is that this calls attention to that fostering co-learning, feedback and learnings. And so as an evaluator, I often rely on this to assess the performance of me, myself, our team, and make changes as needed to improve our roles directly from the perspectives of critical learning partners. And this ties back to the getting input from the people that we're involving in the work. This is an explicit call for actively collecting that input, reshaping the process, being open and flexible to any adjustments as needed. Then there are about 9 of them. So having a focus on local relevance of social issues with an ecological perspective. So this one I think is most helpful for informing our practice for evaluation engagement. There's a lot of work that's being developed that based on this principle that provides guidance on and is actively outlining the processes and outcomes specific to partnerships. So Nina Wallerstein, if you want to take a look, she's got a lot of work that's building out on measurable ways of trying to capture and assess factors that we know matter for successful partnership, so engagement. And so this can really offer some guidance on what we need to pay special attention to in terms of the historic trust and mistrust issue, varied levels of context that we need to really pay attention to because they actively affect engagement. And so to make this short, and I can go on, but the idea of context in engagement is made more concrete with what's behind these principles, what's being built behind them. Ensuring transparency and dissemination emphasizes the idea that dissemination is a partnered approach. And this is again, not something that's unique to this. And I know that it may not always work out that way, but generally the principle really pushes us to think beyond the current partnership itself. Encourage one to consider how can all partners either serve as reviewers, co-authors, co-presenters, and what this can do is really promote a sense of co-ownership of the evaluation. It can facilitate information sharing and be a key ingredient to promoting action to use the evaluation results in some way, which ties back to our capacity building principle. And so if we think back to some of the limitations that I shared earlier in this presentation about the extent of decision-making that critical learning partners are being involved in. So that's still a glaring problem. But if we want power sharing to be more widespread in evaluation practice, there needs to be more guidance and the value add in doing that. So I know what the value add is, but there are some in the field that aren't on board with that, or that tend to think differently about the quality of the data if there is that form of shared decision making. But again, focusing on what we can control, because I know there are these other external factors that drive us. So like the other practices, this principle involves thinking about the deep participation work. It's not just about involving, but sharing power across all phases of the evaluation, not just any phase, sharing control over the direction of the evaluation, how information is shared. And so when we, based on my experience, apply this principle in practice in my engagement, a lot of my efforts focus on acknowledging and mitigating power differentials. So how am I ensuring that I'm creating that space for not just input, but for the feedback that will ultimately change how my thinking around it, or enhance my thinking around a certain decision about the project. And so infusing shared decision making with this principle helps shift my focus onto how can I make the evaluation process strengthen my community members' ability to continue engaging with me in a way that's, again, a critical friend, continuing the evaluation efforts, and also in a way where they're able to understand and use evaluation data in some way that is independent of me, which ties back to fostering that capacity building. And the last thing I have here is the principle related to promoting long-term process with a commitment to sustainability. So Shalimsky, and I know sustainability might be a trigger word for some evaluators, but there's a lot of body of work that's being developed right now. Shalimsky and Teasdale have provided some really cool research that shows that there's a limited attention to planning for sustainability and assessing program sustainability in the context of evaluation. And what I'm suggesting is that these discussions about sustainability can also influence how our partners choose to engage with us. So it's also shaping our practice components of engagement. And so in that writing that I shared in my own work with Flint community members, I heard explicitly, we were working a lot with community partners in participatory projects, and I heard many community partners share how they were exhausted by people coming in and out, interventions being developed and not sticking, and that often made them hesitant and unwilling to continue participating in any of the partnered projects. And so that often started us from a position of rebuilding, rather than people being excited that they're invited. There's a lot of context behind that, historical context behind that. And so embedding this principle really shifts our focus to include those considerations of sustaining the relationship. So this might go far beyond evaluation to an extent, but there's some work being built out, and what I'm suggesting is that the discussion point should also be made central to our engagement practice. So these are the principles. I'll mention that these are very idealistic and can be fraught with challenges in trying to apply them in practice because of several of the challenges that you all shared in the chat, external factors. And you can also view these as iterative, multidimensional approaches that can be carried out throughout different phases of the evaluation. So different ones can be prioritized. So where can we go with these principles, right? That's the question, like, so what? So the way that I'll respond to this question is having us reflect back to the critiques of program evaluation, and why evaluation engagement came about, and ultimately the challenges that we continue to navigate, as we're doing this work. And where my lens is, as I've mentioned before, is that CBPR principles and a lot of the work that's behind them, the underlying theories, can complement and enhance our practice in different ways. And this is by offering some ways to deepen relationship building. They can help enrich, based on my experience, enrich how we approach those relationships by interrogating power in different ways, whether it's through sharing of information, redesigning, sharing the decisions that you're making about the evaluation design itself, fostering co-learning, capacity building, etc. And so if we can enhance evaluation engagement practices with relationship building, quality relationship building focus, that looks at, assessing meaningful participation and trustworthy, then we can likely be able to increase, we will likely have better evaluation results, but we will also have these strong, be focused on building that relationship rather than focusing on how it advantages the evaluation only. So I'm going to walk through a couple of concrete examples on how I've applied CBPR principles with some of the common challenges that we discussed in the book chapter, just to give you some insight into that. There's a lot more. I just formulated tidbits of it and captured some of the elements for discussion today, but just to give you some ideas. So the first challenge that I wanted to share is related to how partners engage. So all of this is about engagement, but specifically partners' experiences in engaging. So we find and by we, I just mean me, we find that while we do all this work to prepare the engagement, I've secured the funds, I have the project, I have the questions, I have the resources, but my partners still don't know how to engage meaningfully. Like they're a little bit confused about their roles. They're not familiar with the evaluation itself. Like they're not understanding what's going on. And or there have been other barriers that are making their participation more difficult that just were not on my radar because I didn't assess in the interim. I may have assessed at the beginning, but I didn't assess in the interim. And this could be like something small that could ultimately make a major change, like the time of the meetings or the language that we were using in the materials that we were sharing out. And so that's the issue. That's the challenge on the left. And so in this scenario, I've already designed the evaluation. We had our kickoff call, for example, but leaning towards these engagement practices, I know that I have to be open and flexible to make changes. At any point, I really have to stay open to that process. And so by embedding certain principles from CBPR into practice, I'm trained to think about how I'm fostering co-learning, capacity building, again, not just for my partners, but for my own practice and my team's practice. And so we ended up creating these feedback surveys with the option of one-on-one calls to provide us, as an option, because sometimes that's just not feasible for people, to provide us some insight into how the participation of meetings were going. How were the meetings going? And what I learned is that this particular group that I'm sharing about from this example, they're not understanding their roles because there isn't a clear map of what's happening. There's one meeting, there's also inconsistent participation and engagement from people. So they move from one meeting to the next. Certain people don't show up. So we don't know where we left off. And so there's a lot of confusion and inconsistencies. And so that leads into developing a community charter, right? That outlines the roles, responsibilities, something visual that can help document that roadmap for people, rather than just relying on what we said last, the recording, the meeting agenda notes. And another issue is that we start finding that other partners don't understand because the idea of evaluation might be new, or we're using acronyms all the time. We're using acronyms all the time. And people are just not capturing the information as quick as we'd like. And so we start thinking about like a resource guide and being mindful of our language, and not having it a policy to not use acronyms. And one important lesson for that was that how our partners tended to define community. And there were a lot of variations in what people meant when they were saying community. And so that lack of unfamiliarity was often due to us, not having that same language and finding, and really understanding and finding that alignment that was needed really helped us move forward. And so throughout all this, we're engaging in feedback constantly to foster co-learning. We're relying on the community resources. So what is it that is more appropriate for them to use in terms of their language, to make improvements to the engagement process overall, or the evaluator role overall. And the point here is that, we created this space to understand and learn about our partners and learn how to make our engagement better. And so it's really about having this bidirectional, this is why I have these cycles, this bidirectional relationship dynamic that can only work if we are open to that communication and open to creating that space, if we stay curious, if we understand that our community partners also know things. They are communicating in certain ways. They have strong resources and assets that we need to make sure we're including when we're designing tiny pieces of the work itself, and be engaged in order to make our project successful. Have one more example and then one more slide, and then I'll open up for questions because I know I'm a little tight on time. Well, yeah. So another example that I share in that writing is, and I've heard multiple partners share this, that this is just going to end after the money's gone or after the project is gone, and the consequences of so that's some insights that you're hearing from your partners. That's the expectations that you're hearing from partners, and the consequences of leaving those perspectives unaddressed are that they may position the engagement that you're doing as transactional. I've been, I'll tie this later, but transactional, there's potential harm to relationships. And as an aside, I've been writing about how, there are different elements of positionality. So there's time, alignment that can really inform how communities are perceiving us. And there's this issue of, the qualities of the evaluator role having all these multiple identities that they may not necessarily be aware of, but it's actively in the mind of the community member as they're perceiving you. And so there's a lot going on in this challenge. And so in applying the principles, it's really about I adopt this growth mindset and step into that engagement with a lens toward long term, whether it's another project or I just see them again at a community event. I never engage with critical learning partners in a way that I'm assuming that this is just for this one project timeline, will be done shortly. I'm sure there are partners that, you feel that way about, but really, centering that long-term lens with the people that you're trying to engage in the work in a meaningful way matters. And so what I try to do is really invest in that relationship in different ways. And so what these principles push for is emphasizing that focus on sustaining the relationships or the program, but just having the discussion about why this matters for that longer term, whether or not you're involved in that. It's not making a promise that you're going to sustain anything, but it's just sharing that your priorities are on that longer term process. It also carries these implications for accountability. So I strongly feel that we have a personal responsibility for the long-term implications of the data that gets generated through our results. And so that's not something that's generally agreed upon, but that's what I've been trained to think as. And so there are ways to use these principles as checks. There's some work being done right now that is making these principles, these CBPR principles, measurable, and you can use those as a reflection tool or an actual interim activity, similar to how you would do positionality as part of the work, to assess whether the project has been embedding those core principles to prioritize relationships and power. And the last thing I'll mention is that part of some of the critiques of CBPR principles is that they don't explicitly call out certain pieces that are often implied. And so there has been a lot of work that's done already in terms of making the who more explicit, so CBPR principles that are explicit to engaging, addressing racial inequities, addressing power, cultural humility. And so what we had discussed and proposed in that book chapter is thinking about, the principles extending to this ongoing relationship building aspect. So tying, kind of intersecting the two of having that long-term process with the relationship building piece. The other piece was about positionality through a relational lens. When I mentioned this earlier, and I'm obsessing about it right now, but just thinking about different components of positionality. We often think of individual positionality and organizational positionality, but even within those, there's different components that are shaping how we're engaging with people. And so that's something that I had proposed in the book chapter is practicing interrogations of positionality through that relational lens. And again, when we start to apply evaluation engagement generally, but also CBPR principles, that really changes the traditional role of the evaluator while emphasizing who we are in context, like who we are actively is shaping the work in the process. The last thing that I had was just reflexivity, making reflexivity as part of evaluation practice. There's some work being done on this in terms of, I know there's been other evaluators who have suggested making reflexivity as part of the methods. And so that's an agreement. So just thinking about how different practices of reflexivity, not just one in the moment, at the beginning and at the end, but throughout the evaluation process in collaboration with the person that you're engaging can be really essential for the practice components of engagement. And some of this is also in alignment with the AEA competencies and standards of having respect for people, cultural humility. And so I think these are, again, nothing new, but need to be merged in order for us to be able to improve our approach. So just a good place to incorporate into evaluation engagement practices. The last thing I'll mention is that these principles and engagement itself, I think, require training. So because I've been formally trained in using these, I have some insight into how they're being measured, the work that's being developed. But the takeaway is really that we stay as ongoing learners, that we have a willingness to listen to community concerns while also confronting our biases to make these, as we're doing our engagement practices, meaningful, successful, and to the benefit of the populations that we're trying to reach. And the last thing I'll close out for questions is, okay, I see your questions. But the last thing I'll leave you with is to be mindful that just because we engage people does not necessarily mean that our evaluation is not going to promote harm to the people that we're engaging. And because of that, it's really important that we stay reflective, all the components that I mentioned earlier, to be guided by core principles that can emphasize factors that are needed to ensure we are thinking about those mutual benefits, that we're ensuring we're working to the benefit of the communities that we're involving, and to continue building this body of work in, whether it's practice component studies and evaluation engagement. But that's where I will end it, and I will open up for questions. I see some in the chat. Okay, so let me get there. I don't know if folks want to jump in, but it's open for questions.
Yeah, and feel free to just unmute or raise your hand if you have a question.
So I see one question about positionality. Thank you. So positionality is referring to, sorry, I had assumed, I make assumptions sometimes, which is good for my learning. Positionality refers to this idea that and there's different things, but what I'm talking about is the evaluator's role and how the evaluator's role often holds these different identities, both tied to their individual identity, tied to their evaluator role overall, like the decision-making body that they have, the profession, and the concept is really about how those identities hold power, positions of power and privilege, and they can be shaping the process of engagement. So your community member may often be looking to you as a privileged person, even though you may identify as, you may hold these other identities. And so it's a really convoluted body of work, but the idea is that who we are matters and is shaping our decisions and our process. Thank you, Miles. Kate, I see your question. Can you provide examples of community engagement in the initial proposal development and program evaluation design phases versus being? Yes, I can provide an example. So it does take time. There are probably certain periods that you would know that a certain proposal has been released. But generally you would have to ensure that you have partners already established from either a past experience or you've been working to build that relationship for some time with the intent to go after some work. So that pre-work has to be in place first. The other piece about the initial, so once you identify the proposal, like you have those conversations, but it's the idea is that you generally really have to have that established relationship at first, because if you're just kind of, once the proposal gets out and you're like, hey, do you want to do this? We haven't worked together yet, but this proposal is due in 2 weeks. Like it can become very problematic because your timeline is not the same as your community partner's timeline. And so, and I know that's more work to be mindful about. But thinking about, what can you do to start building those relationships earlier without even having that proposal already, that selected proposal already, is what I would recommend. And that's conversations. It's, we need to take a step back. It's really about people skills at that point, And so that's what we've been trying to do as well. It's not
Okay,
easy.
thank you so much. And we are out of time, but we really appreciate your presentation. I think you've given a lot of food for thought here. I had even some private messages that were like, this is so great. So I wanted to thank you for your time and thank you everybody for joining us. There's links in the chat if you want to join our mailing list or see we have one more remaining presentation for the year and then we'll come back in the fall. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.